You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
If you who've been listening to these programs for any length of time know that hardly a week goes by that I'm not pleasantly surprised and impressed with who is reading the Dixie Heritage newsletter. It just never ceases to blow my mind. Some of the neat people that are subscribing to the newsletter. When we started it back in 2015, I had no idea that just a few short years later that not only would it be as large as it is today, or that it would have evolved into a weekly radio program, or that some of the celebrities and political figures and news commentators and just some of the people that subscribe to it, that they would, and that it would become the force that it has become. But it just never ceases to amaze me. And another one of the very neat people that we have subscribing to our newsletter is my friend Guy Malone. And Guy is someone who I met, I would say back in 2008 when I was a pastor in Roswell, New Mexico. And Guy Malone is the head of an organization called Roswell Mission. And it's actually a Christian outreach to UFO researchers, to people who believe themselves to be the victims of alien abductions and so forth. It's a very interesting and unique ministry. Something you would have to go to Guy's website, roswellmission.org, to find out more about. But today we're going to interview Guy Malone, and we're going to talk about the Roswell incident and what really happened. And it's probably wasn't what you would think. Guy was one of the organizers of the recent Roswell UFO Festival. He helped to put together a lot of the programs and things in that, and was recently recognized by the city of Roswell and by the local newspaper there, being front page there for the presentation that he gave at this recent UFO festival. And he talked about what really happened at Roswell. And exactly what was it that the government was covering up, because there was a government cover-up. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And it's a little different than the things we normally talk about here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. But I think you're really going to enjoy listening to this week's broadcast, even if you're not someone who would normally be into ufology or space aliens, science fiction, conspiracies, how whatever angle you say, well, that's not my thing. Don't tune out just yet. Keep listening, because I think as you listen to Guy Malone, and as you listen to what really happened at Roswell and what the government was really covering up, the fact that the government had secret Nazi scientists that they had basically kidnapped toward the end of the Second World War. They were keeping them secretly in this country. Of course, we know about some of them that were working on things, and we know about them. But there were a whole bunch of others that even the President of the United States had said, don't bring them here. Don't do that. We're not going to continue those experiments. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. And certain rogue agencies in our government disobeyed direct orders of the President of the United States. And go figure, like that doesn't happen in our modern day. Anyways, what happened at Roswell is totally different from the official story, and it's also totally different from a lot of the alien lore that you normally hear as well. I remember just a couple of weeks ago, I say a couple of weeks, actually it was a couple of months ago now, when we did our interview with John Schneider. I think that was back in February. It was at the time that the Alien Intrusion movie was coming into the theaters. And of course, John Schneider was the narrator in that movie. And Guy Malone was also featured in that movie. And so I had mentioned, at that time, I'd mentioned my association with Guy Malone. And so Guy was talking about these things in movie theaters across the country here just a couple of months ago. And of course, now he was speaking again in more detail at the Roswell UFO Festival. And of course, he'll be giving us the skinny here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. So stay tuned. It's going to be a wild ride.
And what I want to do with that Roswell mission is I was promoting the fact that we were playing that movie during the UFO Festival. Joe's son gave us a new teaser trailer for Joe and I's talk. So I'm going to probably replace, or I am this weekend, going to replace that Alien Intrusion video with the talks with the Roswell teaser video. And I also have a link to the Roswell Daily Record where the talks we did was a front page story this year.
So
picture on page 3, but the headline was on the not the top headline. The top headline was Stanton Friedman's retiring and won't be back to Roswell again. So it was a farewell Stanton day at the UFO Museum and during the UFO Festival. But Joe, of the 15 or 16 UFO speakers in town, Joe and I were the headline for one day on the front page. So not many, only 2, 3, 4 speakers during the whole 3 days make their front page headline.
You know, there was this elaborate conspiracy and cover up, and of course, you know all the stories. And if people don't go for that, they go for the exact opposite extreme, which was nothing happened. It was just a weather balloon. You know, accept the official story. You know,
Yeah.
Everybody who questions it's a conspiracy nut, and you know, you're showing that that there was a cover up, that there was a conspiracy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what was being covered up was quite as crazy as...
It was alien. Yeah, bingo.
Yeah.
You got it right on the nose. Is that in the whole area of researching the Roswell incident and living here since the late 90s as I did, I would occasionally hear from people or meet people or someone would tell me they had a relative who was credible and they believed there was an incident and that the military hushed it up and that people were threatened. So before I even really got a handle on researching the German Nazi UFO and Operation Paperclip angle that I've developed for the whole talk now, is that I had to come from it from the perspective of, you know what, these people aren't lying. I believe what people are telling me, even though I wasn't in touch with that many people that were 70 years old that might have been right there close or involved with the incident. But living in a community where the event impacted just the local flavor, the local psyche or whatever, is that people believed it happened. People believed that people were threatened to keep their mouths shut about it. I had to take that at face value as an actual truth going into any level of research of wanting to know, well, what really happened then? Because my belief at the time, and I guess you'd say still, was that I honestly don't think extraterrestrials exist, or at least had made it to Earth at the time. You know, if I were to say, try to recapture my mindset from 2002 is when I first published the Roswell UFO Crash.com website. I had to take it from I was thinking, well, even if aliens exist, you got to ask the question, have they ever mastered faster than light travel to get here to Earth? And even if that were true, is the Roswell incident an example of such that failed? Because you know, you kind of scratch your head and you go, wait a minute. If there's an alien race that can travel, you know, billions of light years across space, not run into any space dust, no asteroids, you know, not blow up. Maybe you've seen the videos by now, especially from the Alien Intrusion movie where they recreate, if you're traveling at 1/10 the speed of light and you hit a grain of dust, you know, that's right. The equivalent is going to be over a nuclear explosion. But anyway, okay, so you can master space travel, traveling the galaxies across light years, but then why are all these reports of UFOs crashing? Because Roswell is far from the only reported UFO crash. There was one in Aztec, New Mexico, just a year or two different from the 47 incident. And the true UFO conspiracy buffs that go to the conferences, they claim that there's been dozens of crashed UFOs and retrievals. There was an actual crash retrieval conference years back where people would get together to discuss the cases and what was new on the files of a UFO crash case here in America, over in South America. Like, there were dozens of UFO crashes that were allegedly being, whether they were shot down or crashed on their own. And so anyway, I want to emphasize that, okay, well, if aliens exist and if they can master space travel, why do their ships crash so easily here in the United States because of a lightning storm? Or really, you think we can shoot down something that advanced? But I did not go into the research originally to debunk. I realized these people are telling the truth. So what really happened? And that's where I came across originally from Dr. Heiser, Mike Heiser. I think you're familiar with his work a little bit. He was suggesting the German Operation Paperclip angle a little bit. So I just did a lot of Googling and found out, I think that's more likely what happened than anything else. And that's when I presented the website originally that led to the lecture we do now, or that I do publicly now.
Well, before we get into the details of Operation Paperclip, I remember reading, and this is 10 years ago, so I'm reciting this stuff from memory, and it's probably it's probably in a lot more recent memory for you than it is me. You're far more familiar with it. But about 10 years ago, I remember reading some information that basically was claiming that the Nazis had bases in Antarctica and that they were attempting to launch spacecraft from Antarctica because the gravity of the Earth and so forth was less there. It was easier for them to get them in the air, saucer-like craft. And that they may have actually even had saucer-like craft in outer space in the 1930s.
I've read those same reports, or some of them anyway, and that's not an angle that I take or that I promote. I've not found it verifiable enough. I know a lot of people will take the angle that after World War II, the Nazis disappeared to Antarctica, and I find it interesting, but I've never been consider myself a specialist or a proponent of that particular view. What I put related to the Roswell crash incident was that the Nazi scientists who weren't hung or jailed at Nuremberg trials, whether there were some that went off to Antarctica or not, to secret underground bases to keep the Nazi party going, that is one popular conspiracy theory that I don't really affirm or reject because I don't know enough about it to speak into it. But there is a definite track record of over 100 of them that were moved to the United States. That you can actually get a photo of the 100 plus scientists on. I originally took it from NASA.gov, but it's on Wikipedia now.
I guess what I'm asking you, and maybe you can't speak to it, is whether or not those 100 Nazi scientists were just duplicating something that they had already done for the Germans.
Yeah, definitely. That is my thesis for sure, that there were, during the last 2 or 3 years of World War II, there were some experimental prototype flying craft of different shapes, sizes, and design that Hitler was working on, things that looked nothing like a standard airplane that we would know of in the World War II era. There's books like Man-Made UFOs and Hitler's Flying Saucers that people can get now that have actual photos of round flying machines and other different shapes too. The Bell is a famous one too. So yeah, you're right in that sense, that I completely believe that they were working on very different propulsion systems, very different shaped vehicles, just advanced flying machines that were going higher and faster than anything the U.S. or the Allies, Russians, Germans, Japanese had at the time. The Nazi scientists were developing these things in prototypes, but they were never in mass production, because there's a historian, a CIA historian, who wrote that had Nazi or had Hitler gotten these flying machines into mass production, the Allies would have lost the war. He had some amazing superior technology under development and in the prototype test stages They just never got them into mass production. So yeah, when World War II ended, the U.S., the Soviet Union, South America, Argentina, many different governments started stealing away these scientists from Germany to come and create those craft on their soil. And I don't know as much about what happened outside of the United States, but it is documented that some of these Nazi scientists who were creating these exotic flying craft went to Russia, some went to South America, and Joseph Farrell has a book and a couple of books in the angle of them going to South America. So, and I'm more aware of and versed in. There were over 100 of them, including Warner von Braun. That's a name a lot of people. I'm 49 years old. A lot of people older than me will know Warner von Braun's name very well. He was on the Apollo moon project. But we imported over 100 Nazi scientists to the United States and kept them in basically secret underground labs, but whether they were underground or not. Dayton, Ohio, White Sands, New Mexico, and Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas is where they were mostly divided up and working out of. But the fact that they were here was covered up. That was not declassified for decades later. But yeah, American for sure, or American bases were employing and housing Nazi scientists with experience on building wildly exotic experimental aircraft. And they've just started doing it right here in the U.S.
So then the ship that crashed in Roswell, you would think would have probably been launched from either El Paso or Las Cruces?
Yeah, or maybe even Dayton, Ohio, or White Sands, Fort Bliss, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio are the three bases that I identify from the government archives where these Nazi scientists were assigned to work out of. Oak Ridge Tennessee is another possibility, but yeah, my hypothesis is that it was a local U.S. built and launched experimental craft, just like the one that Kenneth Arnold saw a couple months before the Roswell crash happened. Are you familiar with his name, the pilot Ken Arnold?
No, sir.
Oh, it's wonderful. He was a experienced pilot and also a decent artist. The actual phrase "flying saucer," people don't really get this, is that Mount Rainier, Washington State, the pilot Kenneth Arnold reported some really strange flying craft that he witnessed from not too much of a distance. And he told the press what he saw, and he drew a picture of it as well. And the thing is, it was not a round craft that he saw. It wasn't shaped like a circle. It was more of a boomerang disc. You might even, if you can picture the stealth bomber, but more rounded than that. I have pictures of it up on the websites, and when I do it in a public presentation, people are like, gasp, holy cow. But the reason he told the press that when he's observing the flight characteristics of these craft, he said that they skipped like saucers would on a lake, just like if you throw a skipping rock. He said that they skipped like saucers. He didn't say it was shaped like a saucer, and many UFO historians are really quick to note the difference here. So when Kenneth Arnold said they skipped like saucers, the press grabbed the phrase flying saucer just a month or two before the Roswell incident. The phrase flying saucer was in the news now. It was in the American psyche. It was all over. It was a buzzword in the media. What are these saucers flying around? But the phrase flying saucer was actually misleading because Kenneth Arnold actually drew the shape of his craft, what he witnessed, that it was more of a manta or a boomerang shape, just a flying wing, honestly. That's a flying wing. Think of a hang glider that's ultra deluxe. Beyond that, a hang glider with motors on it now. And that's what he said. He said he drew the picture. He said it skipped like a saucer. The press got a hold of the phrase flying saucer. So then when just 2 months later, when the Roswell incident happened, the headline read that a flying saucer was captured. And then the drawings from those witnesses compared to what Kenneth Arnold saw and then what I do with the PowerPoints and the photographs from the 1940s is when you compare what the Germans were working on in 1943, in 1944, in 1945 in Nazi Germany, it is exactly the same style and body of craft as Kenneth Arnold reported in 1947, and as many of the Roswell witnesses who allegedly cleaned up the wreckage drew for the researchers decades later in books. The connection between the craft that crashed at Roswell, if you believe the witnesses who drew pictures for the researchers, and if you compare that to the drawings and the photographs from Nazi Germany, it's a shoo-in when you actually see it live. It's harder to do audio, radio interview like this, but it's almost the exact same craft, just a year or two different technology. And when you see it in person, it's kind of a slam dunk. Oh, okay. Well, the craft that Kenneth Arnold saw was obviously a German design. It was called the Horton Ho, was the craft that was most popular then, and there's Wikipedia and U.S. documents of us actually importing the prototype, the Horton Ho, from Germany into the United States. There's actually a picture of one from Wikipedia that I present as part of the lecture. You're like, oh, okay, mystery solved when you put them all
Let's
together.
Hear for a brief word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review, and when we come back, we'll be once again with our guest, Guy Malone, and we'll be talking about the alien bodies that were recovered from the crash site at Roswell. Were they actually human beings that were being experimented on by evil Nazi scientists who were being held against their will by our own government? If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. How do you explain the alien bodies that were found in the spacecraft?
I don't explain alien bodies, for starters. If there were bodies, the thing is that this is a mythology that has spun for decades, with many so-called witnesses chiming in decades later after the actual incident. If you get back to the original reports of the Roswell craft, there may or may not have been any bodies in it. Some people never report it, but let's say 1 to 3 bodies are reported. It's a kind of a horrible turn that I have to introduce a topic for people, that the United States has a horrible, hidden but publicly available to find now record of human experimentation on individuals. Some of the most documented works are on our prisoners of war, Mongoloids, Japanese people that were messed up in radiation experiments. The U.S. experimented on our own people. But when I decided, I told you, I came at this from the angle, well, these reports are true. The witnesses are not lying. You might know the story related to Roswell is the mortician Glenn Dennis, who lived in Roswell, and he's one of the founders of the UFO Museum originally in the 90s. He said that the military called him for child-sized caskets. They wanted not adult-sized caskets, so that's where the alien, a lot of the stories come from, that they were short little beings. And somehow or other, I was pretty aware of the fact that there was human experimentation going on in the United States when I was writing this article in 2002 originally. So, and it's a horrible thing to imagine But I decided, well, okay, let's say they're true, but if they are or aren't alien is the question now. So I just had to say, well, I've kind of sold myself that the craft has a terrestrial explanation. The if you believe the witnesses that the craft really did crash and that the government really did come in and clean it up and the government really did tell people to keep quiet about it, I had sold myself on the hypothesis already. Well, there's these Nazis that the president forbid be brought onto United States soil, but the group, the joint that would become known as the CIA, they did it anyway against the president's orders and hid them away in secret bases so that they could continue building these craft. So to me.
So then this was the CIA and not the Defense Department that was doing these things.
Correct. It was a Joint Intelligence Officers Association or something like that. I forget the acronym, JOIA, something like that. It's documented on the website. When I do the presentation, I have it in front of me. But it is the group that became the CIA eventually. You're right, not the Defense Department that had all these Nazi scientists working for us. You know, black ops in the 40s, crazy thing.
Yeah.
And they were going against the president's orders on some of these Nazis that they brought in because they're people that should have been hung at Nuremberg for human experiments for crimes against humanity. But we brought them in anyway and literally continued the experiments. I document on the site that from the archives that the U.S. was experimenting on humans in the United States, American citizens, without their consent. And it wasn't until John Glenn, former astronaut, former senator, in the 90s, went before Congress, and he got a bill passed that prohibited human experimentation without informed consent. It's crazy to believe that up until the late 90s, it was actually, I won't say it was legal, but it was not illegal in the United States for the government to perform experiments, or any corporation for that matter, to perform experiments on American citizens without their knowledge or without their consent. And then there's a proven track record going back to, I think, the 1930s of the U.S. doing things like radiation experiments on human beings, different drugs, different diseases, either letting them take their course or injecting people. And some of the people that were doing this for us were the same Nazi scientists who were in these labs. So anyway, let's say I believe the bodies. What I did was, okay, wait a minute. I have a satisfactory terrestrial explanation for the craft that was found. And I have pictures from Nazi Germany that look just like what the Roswell witnesses described. So to me, it was kind of a slam dunk that the craft could be explained. Then, like you asked earlier, so what about the bodies? With that knowledge behind me, I just, out of the blue, this was I typed into Google, symptoms, bald head, large eyes. Is there a human terrestrial explanation that could fit the bill of what some of the witnesses described as short people with bald head and large eyes? And yeah, actually there is. There's a disease called progeria, or rapid aging, that actually gives people lifespans only in their teens. But all of the medical documents, Wikipedia, everywhere you go, describes progeria victims. And then there's pictures that are actually hard to look at of human beings, but they're in their teens. They're age 10 to 14. Kids with little spindly bodies, with very large, disproportionately large heads and large eyes, and they're bald. And I'm like, oh no, that's sickening. And then between myself and then another researcher, Nick Redfern, there's actually a paper trail documenting the government's use out of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. That's why I threw that in earlier. And Fort Stanton, New Mexico, of doing human experimentation on both prisoners of war, Japanese radiation victims, and American citizens with dwarfism, gargoylism, progeria, rapid aging. There's a list of like over a dozen diagnoses of people, and like 30 or 40 of them were under the age of 15, according to the documentation from the Clinton National Laboratories that Nick Redfern pulled out in his book, Body Snatchers in the Desert. He published that a couple years after I put out my site, RoswellUFOcrash.com. And it was sickening. It was heart-wrenching, actually, to realize. But yes, the government has experimented on people. Yes, the government did use unfortunates like progeria victims, mongoloids, dwarfism, gargoylism. These are diseases that people are just kind of put away from society, especially when you go back 50, 60, 70 years ago. You talk about, people could just have mental problems and they'd get locked away in an asylum and you would never hear of them again. Families with money would put would get rid of their deformed or their mentally deficient children. And in many cases, the government, and I'm not hypothesizing here. I'm informing people that there is a documented track record of government documents showing experimentation on human citizens, and especially undesirables that were shut away from society. So if you have an experimental craft that is going up to high speeds and high altitudes that have never really been tested or worked out, you get to thinking, well, we all know how that works from the satellite program. You don't necessarily start with astronaut John Glenn. You don't necessarily start with your ace fighter pilot like Chuck Yeager. You start with dogs and monkeys, and you work your way up. You find out what the effects of speed and radiation and altitude are going to be on organic biological material. So you start with one class and you move your way up. And yeah, there is it's depressing, it's dark, but there is a paper trail that's not hard to uncover these days because it's declassified, of human experimentation. And unfortunately, the exact types of people that our government was specifically experimenting on in the 1940s and letting our imported Nazis do a lot of the dirty work is children whose physical description matches the physical description of the bodies that some people say was found at Roswell.
That's just mind-blowing. But the thing is we've come to the point now where so many things have been discovered, at least in the last 10 years or so, or at least in my lifetime, that the things that should shock us and we should say, well, that can't possibly be true, they don't shock us anymore.
You're right. We are desensitized. And even in the 40s, the way I put it to people to kind of soften the shock of what the research uncovers was really true is that according to all the documentation that existed, I try to get people inside the heads of people in the 1940s. We had just won World War II. We were the undisputed world champion superpower. We were the good guys now. We defeated Hitler. But what we know for certain is that the Cold War that started, many other countries were stealing away these German Nazi scientists to their own borders, including Russia, in order to develop technology for what would become the Cold War, the space race, etc. Is that our enemies, so to speak, or at least let's just say other nations, were developing these craft, using these scientists, experimenting on humans in the name of science to advance those individual countries' weaponry and military and stuff like that. So if we didn't do the same, would we soon become a third world country ourselves? Could the commies come over here and wipe us off the map because they were developing better technology, even though the means, it's a question of does the ends justify the means? The Russians, the Japanese, the South Americans, they were continuing high altitude experiments on human beings. on prisoners of war, on deformed children, et cetera, et cetera. If we didn't do the same, would we have gotten behind in this race? And would America be what we believe it is today? I really think, I mean, it's a tough call. It's a horribly hard decision to make. I can't judge it and say that what Operation Paperclip did and what the United States was doing in the 40s and 50s was right. But if your only job is to defend your position as the world champion superpower on the planet, yeah, it's quite easy to see why they made the decisions they did. Horrendous as it is. It's a 1940s version of you can't handle the truth.
Right. So did these things just not work? Because if you look at the rockets that ultimately ended up being built, they're not anything like these experimental Nazi craft or anything like what crashed in Roswell. So did those type of craft simply not work, or did the Nazi scientists specifically sabotage the attempts in this country because they didn't want anyone else to have what they had already developed somewhere else? Or
I think it's a case of a lot of them didn't work, actually. They would build. There's two that were popular. I think you know them from the site. The Horton Ho and the Lippisch P, I think 136 or 138. Those were nicely done craft that were kind of like wings. They were kind of like gliders, but then they were able to attach engines or motors to them. And part of the process that I had to document is that a lot of people have said in the UFO realm that what the United States calls our stealth bomber was back engineered from the Roswell crash. But I use a couple of newspaper articles, online magazines, that actually document that the German design, Horton Ho and Lippisch P-13, as were imported by the Americans and developed, actually became the stealth bomber. Is that there's a literal newspaper articles that describe these 1940s designed vehicles as the precursor to the stealth bomber or the first stealth bombers. So you add a few decades, you go from the 1940s to the 1970s, I think is when the stealth bomber, your question being, did these things not work? Some of them did, some of them didn't. They were all experimental. The stealth bomber is an example of a successful craft that the United States was using that came out of the 1940s German Nazi era scientists' work for us here in the United States. And I'll also say that the stealth bomber is the one that you and I and people listening to you right now know of. Whether there's one or two or 10 new different or other type of craft that were successful, that were developed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, last year, that you and I don't know of, is anybody's guess, you know?
so you had also mentioned that the metal, the mystery metal, the tinfoil, like metal at the Roswell crash, that could magically be wadded up or changed its shape, and then it just goes back to its original form.
Yeah, you're part of the mystery, so to speak, of what really happened at Roswell is Jesse Marcel was the Army Air Base person. He went out and recovered the craft. He was involved in the early, let's go check out the reconnaissance. And what he reported was what became known as mystery metal that did kind of what you said. I don't know if you could like wad it up like into a ball of tinfoil. That may be a picture people might get from their brain, in their mind, from what you said or from what some of the reports are. I don't think it was wadded up like a piece of paper in your hand and then regained its flat shape. But there was a mystery metal that when bent or crumpled would eventually retain its shape, is what the stories are. You would do something with it and it would come back. So when people say, well, heck, I've never seen anything like that before, that must be alien or that must be from outer space. Well, I actually commend that line of thinking in a sense for thinking outside the box. Because you got three pieces of information here now that are very unique to the Roswell case. Is that there's this craft that's never been seen before. And then there's these bodies that don't look like anything I've ever seen before. And there's this metal that has apparently unearthly properties. Therefore, all of this must be from outer space. So the approach I take when I do this as a lecture now with all this information gathered is, well, number one, actually there are craft that look exactly like what the Roswell witnesses reported that were created on Earth a few years before the Roswell crash. So to say that it must be from outer space is incorrect on that point. Then you get to the bodies and you're like, well, actually there are humans who were victims of experimentation that do look exactly like the beings reported on the craft in the Roswell incident. So you don't have to argue that they came from outer space. So now you've got this metal that has exotic properties and bends back into shape. Google again, and you discover there's this thing called nitinol or nitinol, N-I-T, with I-N-O-L, that doing the research, it wasn't known under the name nitinol until the 60s, so it's hard to backpedal, but you do find a paper trail going back to 1932 of something called memory metal that, yes, can be bent, can be crumpled, and it does retain its shape. One of the videos I play, and it goes back to 1932, and oddly enough, the Oak Ridge Institute and the Battelle, I think Battelle Air Force, something or other, they are the two institutions in America that were supposed to have all the paperwork relating to this, the development of the memory metal, and all the files from both those areas disappeared after the Roswell crash. And also again in the 90s or 2000s, a reporter, Billy Cox in Florida, discovered this, that when he tried to research the history of nitinol and memory metal, the U.S. institutions that should have the record of them, all the files had disappeared, remarkably enough. So actually, unfortunately, if you're a fan of the alien hypothesis, but it's not impossible now. It's not difficult. I mean, I don't travel to Washington, D.C., knock on the door of the Pentagon and ask to see the files. I'm not that kind of researcher. For what I was doing in 2002 to put out this theory on the Roswell crash, I was using Google. And I was able to find, in 2002, using Google, what people in 1947 in the military weren't aware of. That 15 years before the Roswell incident occurred, a thing called memory metal was discovered that retained its original shape. And behind closed doors and in laboratories that you and I would never had access to, memory metal was being developed by the United States. And the very people that developed the memory metal, or that were in charge of some of it, were in Dayton, Ohio. Holy cow. If you know your Roswell lore.
So that's where all the crash material was taken to.
Bam, yeah. Oh, okay, so you develop this paper trail and you see, oh, okay, so you got the Nazi scientists in Dayton, Ohio. You've got the memory metal, the people in charge of the memory metal in Dayton, Ohio. And then when the Roswell incident happened in 1947, this General Craigie, who was stationed in Dayton, Ohio, came to Roswell immediately. And then the ship, or the wreckage from the ship of 1947, public record, everybody knows it, everybody in Roswell, every Roswell researcher that writes books will tell you, the Roswell wreckage was shipped to Dayton, Ohio, after it left Roswell in Texas. It's just a simple case of these guys wanted their metal back, is what it appears to be. They wanted their top secret memory metal back before the regular military or the press got a hold of it. Bodies and human experimentation, you can put that off into the more almost theoretical, speculative category if you want to. But now there's a paper trail of the people that were in charge of the memory metal came from Dayton, Ohio, and took it back from the Roswell incident after the ship crash was reported in Roswell and the press got a hold of that news. So anyway, maybe it's harder to visualize, or maybe it's harder to complete the case, but over an audio interview. But when I add a ton of photographs and PowerPoints just to the stuff we've been talking about now, it's kind of a slam dunk. Whenever I presented this in Roswell, like I did it, I created the website in 2002 based on a tip or a couple things Mike Heiser had said about Operation Paperclip in his 2000 book, The Facade. And then in 2005, actually, I emailed another researcher, Nick Redfern, with the earliest version of my webpage. I also emailed the UFO Museum here in Roswell, and they didn't respond. But Nick Redfern got back to me, and he said that he was looking into man-made explanations of the Roswell craft as well. He published a book in 2005 called Body Snatchers in the Desert, The Horrible Truth of the Roswell Incident, where he actually has a whole chapter on progeria and the human experimentation. And he is really good at digging up government documents. He does the work of submitting Freedom of Information Act requests. So he was able to document in his book a lot of the experimentation and actually tie child-sized deformed bodies to Oak Ridge National Laboratory and to Fort Stanton, New Mexico, which is, as you probably know, barely a stone's throw from Roswell.
Of all the programs we've done here on TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, this one's just mind-blowing. But we do have to pause here, and we have a word from our sponsor, the American Free Press, and then we'll be back with our guest, Guy Malone. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch, and AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
The first time I got an opportunity to present this lecture all in one shot publicly was 2010, and I did it twice in Roswell. And you got to imagine, during the UFO Festival, you've got people coming from all over the world to hear about and to celebrate the alien crash. And you get up in front of two rooms full of people on 2 different days, and you present an alternate view that proves, more or less, that it was man-made, and I didn't get lynched. And I got paid by the city $400 for being one of the speakers in their very public UFO Festival conference with a lot of other pro-alien researchers who were on the same stage later that day. The point is, if you're going to do something like that during the UFO Festival when fans are coming from all around the world, you better be able to document what you're saying really well and really convincingly. And what I heard from walking out of it was like, I talked to Joe Jordan a little later that day. He was in the room when I first did the talk. And I was like, hey, you know what? I really think, people didn't boo me. They didn't, nobody in the audience rebutted, well, yeah, but you forgot about this, or you left this out of your theory. And therefore, that blows your whole theory, out of the water. None of that happened. And I remember saying to Joe, you know what, I think about 3/4 of the people were convinced that my view is correct. And he was just like, dude, I was standing at the door watching people walk out for 20 minutes after your talk. He was like, home run, dude. You're way more than 90%. From the chatter, from the conversations he heard about people, he was just standing by the door listening to what people said when they walked out. He was like, it's over 90%. I'm like, wow. He told me that like half hour after the event, after the lecture was over. So, and I've continued to do the same talk here in Roswell a couple times now. Last year, at our, there was an event we called Challenges to the Extraterrestrial Hypothesis, where we had 6 speakers, including myself and Joe Jordan, that were giving alternate views of just UFOs in general. In my case, and Nick Redfern was there, we did our views on the Roswell crash. And our presentation, it was front page news last year with a nice photo of myself and a nice photo of Nick Redfern. And then this year, I represented it again to a much smaller crowd because it was the same talk as last year. And actually, Stanton Friedman was speaking the same time as I was, so I was surprised anybody showed up. But a reporter from the Roswell Daily Record did show up and listened to my talk with PowerPoints for over an hour of laying all this stuff out, and she did an excellent job reporting it in the paper. So, that kind of critical review, like I said, if you're going to present this during the UFO Festival, you better be real sure of your facts and able to make a real convincing case. And again, the fact that I never got lynched or booed, and that the newspaper actually covered it and gave it coverage in the newspaper, it all adds up to a very credible review that what I've been saying for a good 15 years now, here's the proof that the Roswell crash was man-made. At least my view is credible, and it is well received, and it often sways people when they see it done live or on a DVD video. You've got this whole I want to believe factor of people that they either won't come to a presentation that argues for a view different of theirs, or they won't watch it online, so they don't know. They won't expose themselves to the other point of view. But the people that do are usually 90% or better, I think, swayed.
Well, that might be part of the reason I know that you were part of the movie. It just so happened that we had John Schneider on the radio show, and I was interviewing him the day before Alien Intrusion hit the theaters.
Neat.
And of course, you were in that movie as well. Not quite as prominently as John was, at least not in front of the camera, though you may have been in the research.
He was a narrator, of course, yeah. You got to get your money out of Bo Duke.
Yeah.
Get your money's worth.
Right, but but obviously, the fact that you were nationwide in theaters not too long ago, obviously, if anybody listening questions Guy Malone's credibility, he was nationwide in theaters not too many months ago talking about these very things. So,
well, there's many reasons you should question Guy Malone's credibility, but I would not fault anyone for doing so, actually. And ask around. There's a paper trail. there's people that have made hobbies out of not questioning, but making sure my credibility is undermined, actually. But no, thank you for saying that. That's true. I was real proud that Gary included myself, and by the way, Joe Jordan. What we did this year, that movie Alien Intrusion you've given it good coverage. It's the first really, you would say, high budget treatment of the alien topic from an Orthodox Christian perspective that's ever really hit DVD, and especially, like you said, theaters nationwide. It's gone global. But the event we did this year, because Joe Jordan, the Mutual UFO Network researcher that we spoke of earlier, he appeared pretty prominently in the film too as a researcher. I appear not because of my views or my research primarily, but as an experiencer of what people call alien abduction. I'm interviewed, as you know, because you saw it. There's about 5 or 6 people that are interviewed that have experienced some type of alien abduction or what people call alien abduction. My hypothesis, my conclusion, was that it was really a demonic experience. It was being tormented by spirits that just in this day and age they claim to be aliens from other planets, whereas hundreds of years ago it was incubus or succubus, or it was fairies. It was the wee people, so to speak. You think of medieval era Europe, we know of Ireland and England, people reported the fairies, little people with big black eyes that would abduct or take unsuspecting loners away to caves or away to the woods. They'd poke them with magic wands. There may or may not be lewd sexual encounters incorporated into the stories. And then they were returned to society just a little bit crazier for the experience with their tall tales of the fairy people or of elves and all this. So my belief nowadays is that this phenomena has always been at the fringe elements of our culture. Every society throughout history seems to have this little lunatic fringe story of mischievous sprites, jinns, genies, elves, or fairies that is part of the human lore. I think it's a spiritual, paranormal phenomena, more closely, accurately described as demonic in Christian parlance, and that same phenomena that was elves and fairies 500 years ago is just now presenting itself as aliens from other planets to people today. But it's the same thing, little people with big black eyes that take you away and do things and try to drive you crazy.
That's all the time we have for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. We're just about out of time, but I do want to continue this conversation with Guy Malone. We definitely want to talk about his experience, and we want to talk about the work that Roswell Mission is doing. We also want to talk about the Alien Intrusion movie and the details of that, and there's just a lot more that we want to talk to Guy Malone about, but the time will not allow us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue interviewing Guy. We're going to continue recording an interview, but we're not going to play it in this broadcast. What we're going to do is we're going to play it in an upcoming broadcast. Probably wait 2 or 3 weeks, and then we'll come back and we'll have Guy Malone back again as our guest, broadcasting the continuation of this interview, and we'll talk to Guy about all these things. It'll be again just a conversation that not only will it be mind blowing, but it'll be something that you'll definitely want to come back to, definitely want to tune into. And in the meantime, I want to invite you to check out Guy's website. It is www.roswellmission.org, roswellmission.org. And you can find the link there to the talk that Guy gave at the Roswell UFO Festival. And you'll also be able to see the archives of some of the work that Guy has been putting online for the last 15 years. Also want to invite you to check out my website, www.dixieheritage.net, www.dixieheritage.net. When you do, you'll be able to subscribe to the weekly Dixie Heritage newsletter. We'll send that to you absolutely free of charge. No cost, no obligation. And when you give us your email address for the free weekly newsletter, I'll even send you out an ebook copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. Again, no cost, no obligation. I just want to put the materials into your hands. Also invite you to check out the website of our sponsor, the Barnes Review, at www.barnesreview.org. I believe that the Barnes Review is one of the best magazines in print today, And I'm not just saying that because I'm one of the editors, and I'm not just saying that because they're our sponsor. Genuinely believe it would be well worth your time to look into that. So until next week, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless.